Beautiful sunny day. We really do feel that this is an important event, and we're very grateful that you could all join us. I would like to first of all thank our sponsors, the Ethnicity, Race, and Migration Program, the Women's Gender and Sexuality Program, and Public Humanities, the Public Humanities Program. So I would also like to thank our panelists for agreeing to discuss a very complex, ever-evolving, and quite sensitive issue, that of the pursuit of military objectives in civilian universities through both research and teaching. They will each speak for about 10 to 15 minutes. Steve Horn and Alan Ruff will join us via Skype. And then we will hear from our two respondents after that. And then they'll all join us for hopefully lively discussion. We'd love to hear your questions and your thoughts. We have chosen our panelists and our respondents to cover a vast, though necessarily limited, array of tensions, of intersectionalities, of landmarks and intricacies, of research, both entailing specific research projects and also the general principles that guide the approval of research, the development of research, and then on the other hand, we'll also be discussing what it feels like to be a test subject in these kinds of endeavors, and also what it feels like to be a student in this kind of environment. We'd also love to touch on the question of ROTC and the return of Don't Act, Don't Tell, and also the question of unprosecuted rape in the military and how these might affect how we view the relationship between the military and academia. So I'd like to thank everyone, and then I would say that the need for this panel, the thought, the idea for this panel, that many people were involved in organizing, came to us after a series of developments, both at Yale and in other universities. To name a few, the Grand Strategy Program, the return of ROTC, which I mentioned, return of ROTC at Yale, and most recently, the proposal of a Department of Defense training center on campus. In all of these instances, questions of transparency, of shared governance have risen, calling for a reflection not only on how decisions are made, but also more largely on the role of the university, on its relationship to structural inequality and systemic violence in an increasingly militarized state. This conversation is not articulated in terms of pro or against the military, but rather in terms of an ethical praxis grounded in the spirit of conversation itself. The word conversation dates actually from the 14th century, from the Old French conversation, meaning living together, having dealings with others, also a manner of conducting oneself in the world. And from the Latin conversatio, my Latin pronunciation is not as good as my French, which means the act of living with. This exchange, therefore, is not meant to be an antagonistic debate, but rather a gathering of people committed to the project and the practice of critique. We did reach out to professors and fellows from the Jackson Institute, as well as professors who conduct research funded by the Department of Defense, but unfortunately none of them were available or willing to join us in this occasion, but we do hope that in another time they will. So for those who put this particular panel together, our critique is grounded in the bodies and the subjectivities that are affected by and that resist the increasing militarization of universities and the restructuring that it necessarily implies for academic disciplines, both those that are funded and those that are defunded, but also for our communities, for our conversations. So we wish to reflect on the price of imperialism, on women, on our campuses, on people of color, on those who bear the marks of imperialism and who hang on the words, lastly, and I quote, of Audre Lorde, "For to survive in the mouth of this dragon we call America, we had to learn this first and most vital lesson, that we were never meant to survive." So once again, I would like to thank you all, and without further ado, I will let my colleagues, different people who organize this event, will introduce each of our speakers, and so I will let my colleagues and co-organizers introduce everyone.
It's my distinct pleasure to introduce Dr. Michael Siegel. Dr. Siegel is a physician and epidemiologist who graduated from the Yale University School of Medicine. From Yale, Dr. Siegel completed a medical internship and then a residency in preventive medicine and public health at UC Berkeley. He completed a fellowship in epidemiology at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta, and for the past 17 years has been a faculty member at the Boston University School of Public Health. His main areas of research involve tobacco and alcohol, and he teaches courses on social sciences and public health.
Thank you so much. I just want to say a couple words about why it's so important to have this discussion. And I think we're reminded today by the events of today of why this is so important. I mean, this is just a small, what happened today in Boston, the tragedy is just a small glimpse of what the effects that militarism has in the countries where we're at war. Something like this happens in the United States and everything stops. You know, our days stop. All people can talk about is what's going on. And in countries where war is an everyday occurrence, this is this is just an everyday thing. It would not be something to be texting and tweeting about. This is just the way life is. The human impact that militarism has is immense, and that's the reason why it represents an ethical issue. I want to focus on a very specific aspect of this, and hopefully by focusing on the specifics first, it'll allow us to have a little bit of a framework from which we can then perhaps generalize a little bit more. But I want to focus on one specific piece of research that was carried out and actually is being carried out by faculty at the Yale School of Medicine, which is actually my alma mater. And I want to focus on two aspects of this. One is looking at the research from an ethical perspective in terms of whether or not it should even be done in the first place at a school of medicine. And secondly, looking at the human subjects protection issues. So this is the article that I want to focus on. This is a 2010 article published in the journal Psychophysiology. It's called Decreased Respiratory Sinus Arrhythmia in Individuals with Deceptive Intent. And I want to focus your attention on the affiliation here of the authors. The affiliation is listed as Department of Psychiatry, Yale University School of Medicine. And so the very first thing that I want you to note is that this article is going to reflect on Yale University. Because the affiliation here is listed as the Yale University School of Medicine, whatever is in this article is going to reflect on the university. Now, it turns out, and I didn't find this out until after the fact, that this research was not conducted at Yale, or at least the human subjects aspect of the research was not conducted at Yale. And the faculty members involved in this research are what are called volunteer faculty, which mean that they are not employed by the university. They are essentially adjunct faculty. Nevertheless, the fact that the affiliation here is listed as the Yale University School of Medicine means that we have to judge the content of this. If there are ethical breaches in here, Yale has to bear some of that responsibility because its name is, or if it doesn't, it's going to, in the public eye, bear that responsibility because its name is associated with this. So let me briefly summarize what went on in this research. The participants, there were 40 male non-U.S. citizens from Morocco or the Sudan, currently residing in the U.S., young people, and they were recruited through a local Muslim community leader. And the methods were that they purported to obtain informed consent from the subjects. They were then randomized either to a deceptive group or a truthful group. They were taken to a hotel, and they were asked to empty the contents of a briefcase. And the people in the truthful group were instructed that they should complete this task and answer truthfully about their actions. But they were told they didn't do anything wrong. And the deceptive participants were told that this action actually constituted a theft, and that if they were asked about it, they should deny it. Following this mock crime, the participants were interviewed about their activities, and the interviews were conducted in Arabic through an interpreter. During the interviews, the participants were monitored with 2 inductive plethysmography bands surrounding the thorax. There were electrodes inserted through these slots, and there were sensors. Basically, what this means is they were monitoring 2 things: one, their respiratory rate, and secondly, any cardiac arrhythmias or changes in heart rhythm. And why is this important? It's important because this is not simple interrogation. This is not just asking people questions and trying to determine if they're lying or not. This is using a very invasive and advanced method of interrogation, and it's important to recognize that. What was the purpose of the experiment? Well, the way it's described is to extend the deception detection literature with a novel test of a 66% deception base rate with a sample of non-English speaking individuals who required translators. This was done to address the concerns of real-world professionals that base rates of lying or truth-telling in samples of interviewers are not 50%, that detection deception may be more difficult in non-native samples. And one goal was to improve the ability to detect a smaller subgroup of truth-tellers in a larger group of liars, all of whom are not acculturated. Thus, this study represents the first step to testing how well one might detect truthful from deceptive foreign individuals under non-50-50 base rate conditions. All right, I can translate this technical jargon for you. The translation of this is the purpose of this research is to help our military identify whether Islamic terrorists are lying or not. That was the clear purpose of this research. And in fact, if you read the text, there's one paragraph where they kind of give it away. They say we used a high base rate of deception because of our wish to reflect real-world situations in which professionals tasked with national security are confronted with the challenge of finding a small number of truthful people in a larger group of liars. In other words, the real purpose of the research, which we're not disclosing, we're not being transparent about, the real purpose of this is to detect whether Islamic terrorists are lying. So the purpose of this is clearly for national security. It involves the advanced interrogation of suspected Islamic terrorists. Okay. Now, if in the research the authors are not being transparent, we can only imagine the degree of lack of transparency that's happening to the human subjects who are involved in the research. Okay, so I want to look at this from 2 perspectives. The first is, should this research even be going on at the university, at the School of Medicine? These are the 3 aspects of the stated mission of the Yale University School of Medicine. And I want to look through these 3 aspects of the mission and see whether or not this research would help to fulfill any of these 3 missions. So the first mission is to educate and inspire scholars and future leaders who will advance the practice of medicine and biomedical sciences. Does this research in any way contribute toward the advancement of the practice of medicine or biomedical sciences? Well, clearly not. There's no medical purpose here. This is a national security, military objective that's being sought after. Second, to advance medical knowledge to sustain and improve health and alleviate suffering caused by illness and disease. Again, I would argue this has nothing to do with illness or disease. And 3, to provide outstanding care and service for patients in a compassionate, respectful manner. This has nothing to do with providing patient care. So, in my view, this research does not fit into the mission of the School of Medicine because it doesn't advance any of the 3 objectives of the school. The purpose of this is to advance a military objective. It's to help the military identify Islamic terrorists. That's not part of the mission of the School of Medicine. And for that reason, I argued, and will continue to argue, that this type of research does not belong at the Yale University School of Medicine or any school of medicine. Now, I want to focus a little bit on the human subjects aspects of the research. Let's just put aside whether or not it belongs in the first place, but let's assume, okay, they're going to do the research. Is it ethical to conduct the research? So I want to look at it from 2 different criteria. in the human subjects regulations. And the first is the requirement for informed consent. And this is section 46.116A1. And it's the basic requirement for human subjects research. In obtaining informed consent from human subjects, those subjects must be provided with, quote, an explanation of the purposes of the research. And let's think about this from the perspective of the participants, the subjects in this research. Were they provided with an explanation of the purpose of the research? Well, I would argue that it's impossible for them to have been given a complete picture of the purpose of this research. Because in order to understand what the purpose of advanced interrogation is, one would have to understand the way in which the CIA use it, and our nation's intelligence agencies use advanced interrogation techniques. By definition, that's classified information. So unless these human subjects were given classified FBI information on all the ways that the FBI uses advanced interrogation, there is no possible way that the requirements for informed consent under section 46.116A1 could have been met. At very best, they were given a very cursory explanation of it. And that doesn't meet the kind of explanation that subjects have to have. Subjects have to truly understand the research and be able to explain it in lay terms to other people in order to be considered, for it to be considered that they have consented to research. So I would argue that this research was flawed from the beginning, ethically, because there's no way that you can obtain informed consent about research to study advanced interrogation techniques unless people are given classified information about what the purpose of those techniques and the use of those techniques is. The second aspect of it, that I want to talk about in terms of the ethics of this research is the special protection for disadvantaged populations, and that is outlined in section 46.111.3 of the Human Subjects Regulations, and it says, in making the assessment, the IRB should take into account the purposes of the research, the setting in which the research is conducted. It should be particularly cognizant of the special problems of research involving vulnerable populations. And vulnerable populations includes economically or educationally disadvantaged persons. Arguably, the Muslim immigrants in this study are a disadvantaged population. And is it ethically justified to use those immigrants in order to satisfy a military objective? I would argue that actually what was happening in this research is that these immigrants were being used as guinea pigs. They were being used as guinea pigs to help the military advance its objectives, not for any legitimate clearly not a legitimate medical research purpose. The IRB has to consider whether or not research can be approved to begin with. And I just want to point out two of the important aspects of this consideration. In order to approve research, first, the risks to subjects must be reasonable in relation to the benefits. And so from the perspective of medical research, when we look at benefits, when the IRB looks at benefits, we look at what are the medical benefits of the research. How will human health be improved by this research? And I would argue that this research has no human health, no medical benefits. And therefore, even if there were minor risks to human subjects, they would not be offset by the medical risks. So I would argue that a medical IRB would never approve this study, because the IRB could not make a judgment that the risks to subjects are reasonable with regard to the medical benefits that would accrue. Secondly, selection of subjects has to be equitable. And third, if subjects are likely to be vulnerable to coercion or undue influence, there need to be special protections to protect the rights and welfare of those participants. And my final argument that I want to put out there is that this is a disadvantaged community, that they are subject to coercion and undue influence. If you are Muslim and you're living in America in 2013, you are automatically automatically vulnerable simply because of the increased scrutiny and the increased stereotypes and increased interrogation and increased monitoring that goes on and suspicion of terrorist activity. And for that reason, you are a vulnerable population. And special protections would need to be taken to make sure that these subjects were not feeling unduly coerced into participating. And I would argue that there was no such actions taken. What are those actions that should be taken? Well, at the very least, the community needs to be consulted. There needs to be buy-in, there needs to be approval from the community. Community leaders need to be consulted, and the community has to consent as a group to allowing the research to take place. And this did not occur in this place. So basically, in summary, I want to suggest that there are 3 ethical issues that we need to consider. One is, should the research of this type be conducted in the first place at a school of medicine? Second, is it possible to conduct this military type research where the objectives are military in nature if we're not able to give proper informed consent to human subjects? And third, is it ethical to take advantage of disadvantaged populations, especially if they're not given special protection, in essentially using them as guinea pigs to gain research data that's going to be used ostensibly for military purposes? Hopefully that sets a little bit of a stage for the rest of the talk and for the rest of the symposium. I look forward to hearing what everyone else has to say.
Thank you. My name is Alex Lev. I'm an undergraduate at Yale University. And it's my honor to introduce our next speaker, Steve Latham, the director of the Interdisciplinary Center for Bioethics at Yale. Students at Yale might also recognize him as the professor of a number of courses on law and bioethics, as well as the responsible conduct of research. Before he entered academia full-time, Latham served as Director of Ethics Standards at the American Medical Association and as Secretary to its Council on Ethical and Judicial Affairs. His co-edited book, The American Medical Ethics Revolution, was selected by Choice as one of the top academic books of 2000. We're happy to have you, Professor Latham.
Oh dear. You ask a lawyer to talk, and he has a lawyer's instinct, and I have some quibbles with Michael's presentation of one major quibble, which is that there is a way in which you can go before an IRB and get waiver of informed consent for studies that are below minimal risk, where minimal risk is defined as the amount of risk you face in day-to-day life or in a regular doctor's visit. And probably that's what happened in this case. That's what the IRB probably did, is give a waiver of informed consent under the rules. That doesn't remove the background ethical objections you have, and I think it's a very interesting question about the mission statement of the medical school. That's very striking to me. Let me tell you a little story about my bioethics center. There was a biologist at Yale called Art Galston, and Art was a very eminent biologist and a wonderful man. And in the course, he was a plant biologist. In the course of his research, he invented a defoliating agent that he thought was going to be used to make agriculture more productive, make the process of weeding and field clearing easier, and so on. And many years after he had invented it, its name was Agent Orange. Many years after he had invented it, it was adopted by the military for military purposes in Vietnam, and was spread all over parts of Vietnam, destroying ecosystems and hurting some of our soldiers and a lot of Vietnamese people. And Art was completely shocked and appalled by what had happened. And part of his being shocked and appalled issued in his playing a very major role in the foundation of the bioethics program at Yale, because he was very concerned with social responsibility for what is done with science. And I will say that Art's story weighs heavily on me. I do worry a great deal, but I don't find easy questions about weaponization of neuroscience, of nanotechnology, of plain old biochemistry, of synthetic biology. Right? All of these things can be studied as Art studied plants for good ends, and all of them can be mobilized for bad ends. But as I was thinking about what I was going to say in this panel, I was thinking, what do I think, do I have a thought about the general question, is there something wrong, not with one study or another, but with the idea of taking money from the military for research at a university, just with that general idea. And I'll say, and I may be alone on the panel saying this, I can't find anything wrong with the general idea, apart from objections one might have to specific studies for various specific reasons. I can't find anything wrong with the general idea of taking money for research from the military. Let me tell you a few facts about what Yale does in this regard. There are right now a few more than 4,100 active research awards at Yale, of which 69 are from the Department of Defense. That makes it 1.67% of Yale research awards come from the Department of Defense. That's not a very large amount. The Department of Defense has a $12 billion research budget, but it's split among basic, applied, and advanced technology development. Those are the categories: basic research, applied research, advanced technology research. The basic budget, universities take home about half of. The applied, 15%, the advanced technology, 10%. But the applied and the advanced technology go, for the most part, to the 13 universities around the country that have set up special affiliated research centers that are sponsored with the military. And these include, on the one hand, Maryland's Center for the Advanced Study of Language, and on the other hand, for example, MIT's Center for Soldier Nanotechnology. Okay? Again, my question is not whether you like or dislike particular military-sponsored projects, but whether there's something wrong with taking money from the military in general. So, when you take the percentage of these things that go to universities and so on, you look at the total. In 2010, the Department of Defense incurred about $1.6 billion in basic or applied research obligations to universities. They gave $1.6 billion in grants to universities around the United States. And their projected basic research, just basic research expenditures to universities in 2013 are $1.8 billion. Compare this to NIH, $30.9 billion. To the private for-profit pharmaceutical industry, $41 billion. Okay? What do people at Yale use military money to do? Obviously, this, but also properties of materials, computer programming, photovoltaics, fungi as a renewable energy resource, autism causes, prostate cancer therapies. Why does the military study autism and prostate cancer therapies? Because they have 10 million people who they cover, separate from the VA system, all active duty servicemen and their spouses and their children. 10 million people covered directly by military healthcare. So they do healthcare research. They do research on PTSD and its prevention, and because they have big problems with this, they do research on drug abuse and alcoholism and therapies for drug abuse and alcoholism. So there's, they do, I've got a little list here. They do studies on, at Yale. These are all at Yale. Basic immunology, autoimmune disease, and on and on. So the range of things that the military sponsors is quite broad and is not all what we think of as militaristic in its content. I don't want to take too long, so I'll make the pro point that is to be made here. The United States lags behind most other developed countries in the amount of government budget that is given in proportion to GDP. So we're not talking absolute numbers, but we're, I think, number 22 as of the most recent data in the world in terms of the amount of government budget that goes to university research. I like the idea of Americans' taxpayer money being sent to universities to do research. I think that's a good use of taxpayer money. And Department of Defense money is American taxpayer money being sent to universities for public research. And a lot of the research, as I've just mentioned to you, is, I think, fairly benign. I also don't see, given the proportion of research money that comes from the military as opposed to other sources, that the mission of the research campus is being hijacked or dominated by the military. Again, there could be particular researchers that we might worry about. There could be particular research projects that I do worry about. But overall, I think there's something to be said for preferring, as a funding source, a public source rather than, for example, non-public for-profit firms in very large influential industries like pharma, big food, tobacco, oil and gas. Okay? If you think about the impact of US military funding on the literature in psychiatry, there's some, but it's pretty darn small. Now think about the impact of pharmaceutical funding on the literature in medicine. It's enormous. It's absolutely enormous. It's out of control, and it's driven by the desire for profit. If you think about what folks at the Rudd Center say about the parallels between big pharma and big tobacco and what's going on with big food and their research funding agenda, I think we have a lot more to worry about from some other sources than we have to worry about from public funded military expenditures, some of which I have said the last time, some of which I object to severely, but which I don't object to overall in principle. So that's what I wanted to say. Thanks very much.
Hi everyone, thanks for being here this evening, this beautiful afternoon. I'm Michelle Morgan, I'm a fourth year in American Studies, and it's my distinct pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Roy Eidelson. Roy Eidelson is a clinical psychologist and the president of Eidelson Consulting, where he studies, writes about, and consults on the role of psychological issues in political, organizational, and group conflict settings. He is a past president of Psychologists for Social Responsibility, associate director of the Solomon Asch Center for Study of Ethnopolitical Conflict at Bryn Mawr College, and a member of the Coalition for an Ethical Psychology. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. It's a pleasure, honor to be here with this panel and have the opportunity to speak with you. In the film The Dark Knight, which many of you may have seen, there's a scene where Batman is brutally interrogating the Joker. And the Joker responds by offering this commentary about the people of Gotham City. See their morals, their code. It's a bad joke, dropped at the first sign of trouble. They're only as good as the world allows them to be. I'll show you, when the chips are down, these civilized people, they'll eat each other. Joker has a well-known tendency toward excess and ill humor, and that won't change, but I think he makes an important point here. We often tend to think that we're doing what the world forces us to do, and that we would act differently if only the world were different. For example, we may tell ourselves that we'd make different choices if terrorists were not plotting against us, or if we could earn a decent living in a different way, or if there were research funds available for the things we really care about, or if simply staying in line weren't so often the safest path to success. But these days, I think, collectively, we need to be better than the world might easily allow. And I think that's what this conversation about national security and the university is ultimately about. Especially since 2001, collaborations between national security agencies and universities have received less scrutiny than they used to. And an increasing percentage of the money available for university research comes from the Department of Defense or is intended for military and related purposes or investigations. And I think there's a fundamental problem, which is that the national security agenda and the purpose of the university diverge, and quite significantly in some cases. I want you to consider two brief moments of honesty that highlight this reality. First, in 2006, not that long ago, former CIA Director Porter Goss gave a commencement address at Tiffin University in Ohio. And he began by saying, if this were a graduating class of CIA case officers, my advice would be short and to the point. Admit nothing, deny everything, and make counter-accusations. He does go on to acknowledge that that's not exactly what higher education is supposed to be focused on. Second, in 2007, the Army released a new counterinsurgency manual to much recognition and applause in various circles, enough so that one of the lead contributors, Lieutenant Colonel John Noggle, made an appearance on The Daily Show with Jon Stewart to talk about the counterinsurgency manual. And he said he could sum up the book in just a few words. Be polite, be professional, be prepared to kill. He did not note that in academic circles, one of these three is not like the others. But I think that's pretty apparent. National security research is intrinsically different in that it's often focused on ways to counter or defeat presumed adversaries. And in that way, it recognizes opposing moral communities, ourselves and our purported enemies. And in contrast, most university research recognizes a single moral community. And this is a big difference. In regard to recent events here, there could be multiple reasons for conducting research that's aimed at enhancing our understanding of other cultures or increasing cultural competency. But we should be honest about that. Sometimes the primary goal behind such research is to more effectively control and exploit other populations. Also, university research rests upon a tradition of openness and peer review. Academic researchers are expected to share their hypotheses, their methods, their findings, their funding sources, and even their data to advance scientific knowledge. In contrast, national security and intelligence research, by and large, has quite different values, operating largely in secret. When academics work with these agencies on these projects, they often lose the crucial freedom to communicate openly about that work. For psychologists such as myself, such work can create specific ethical problems. The psychology profession is built upon the ethical principle of doing no harm, as is psychiatry and medicine in general. And that principle is threatened when psychologists participate in certain national security projects. Some psychologists have said that we should instead be guided by a new principle, doing as little harm as possible. Others have gone even further and recommended that psychologists, if they are doing national security work, should be exempt from the ethical standards that apply to other members of the profession. And with that, I strongly disagree. Psychology also has a very disturbing history in this general arena, with support from over 100 academic institutions and the involvement of hundreds of social scientists and doctors. During the Cold War, the CIA conducted a massive behavioral science research program called MK Ultra, which was aimed at uncovering the secrets of mind control and successful interrogation. And for decades, the CIA experimented with hypnosis, with drugs, with sensory deprivation, and other mind-altering techniques with the help of many academics. And often the academics did not realize that the work they were doing was funded by the CIA. And they did this research often on unwitting research subjects, including patients, prisoners, and soldiers. More recently, in just the past decade, it appears that research on SEER military survival training conducted by psychologists and psychiatrists was misused by the Bush administration to develop and justify its enhanced interrogation techniques. Those techniques also go by the more familiar names of torture and abuse. An example of current research today of potential concern is being conducted by the relatively new High-Value Detainee Interrogation Group, or the HIG. The HIG is housed at the FBI, but it's comprised of experts from several intelligence and law enforcement agencies. And members of the HIG are authorized to travel around the world to interrogate what are considered high-value terrorism suspects. These teams include people with expertise in linguistics and cultural specialists. It happens that the chief of research for the HIG is Susan Brandon, who for many years was a member of the Yale psychology department. Among its projects, the HIG is currently funding research on evidence-based interviewing and deception detection on what they term non-US populations. This may be, and I emphasize may be, because it's not entirely clear, this may be some of the research going on in New Haven as we gather here. And what's problematic about the research is that the HIG's interrogation and detention protocols are based specifically on the Army Field Manual. That manual permits detainees to be held in solitary confinement for at least 30 days. They can be subjected to stress positions, to environmental manipulations, and to sleep deprivation. And by most standards, these are all forms of abuse of one sort or another. So anyone conducting HIG-funded research is presumably aware of this broader context and has chosen to support the HIG's agenda and policies, at least indirectly. But those who are very unlikely to be aware of this fuller context are the immigrant groups or the other groups who are encouraged to participate in this research. I'm confident that they are not informed of this. And this point about context, I think, is often ignored, especially in arguments offered by proponents of university national security collaborations, including, for example, the proposed Center for Excellence in Operational Neuroscience at Yale's medical school. Supporters of that project insisted that there's nothing wrong with their envisioned research or training. And they said things along the lines of, how can you criticize us for wanting to teach better and gentler interviewing skills to special forces so that people in other countries won't be so afraid of them? But I believe that's a narrow, short-sighted, and rather deceptive stance, and one that ignores the broader agenda that underlies these efforts and that I've tried to describe. Coincidentally, tomorrow is the 50th anniversary of Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from a Birmingham jail. And he was obviously writing in a very different context, but I think he expressed this concern very clearly when he wrote this. I have tried to make clear that it is wrong to use immoral means to attain moral ends. But now I must affirm that it is just as wrong, or perhaps even more so, to use moral means to preserve immoral ends. And to conclude, a decade ago, the chief scientist at the CIA was interviewed by the Wall Street Journal. And he said at that time that his agency was particularly interested in fostering long-term relationships with young scientists. Then he went on to explain that no, he didn't want to turn them into spies. Rather, he said, what he really wanted was to capture them intellectually. And resisting being captured intellectually isn't necessarily easy. And when we fail to resist, whether as students, as faculty, as university administrators, as community members, the potential, what might be called collateral damage, can be enormous and actually immeasurable. And I think that's what makes this conversation and the related efforts here at Yale and elsewhere so important. And again, my thanks for having the opportunity to be here.
Hi, my name is Dana Asbury. I'm a fifth-year graduate student in sociology and women, gender, and sexuality studies. And I am meant to introduce Kica Matos to you. However, we were heartbroken this morning to hear from Kica that she is not well. And so she is not here. And I know that you are all sending her healing vibes along with me, that she is feeling better soon. But as I was meant to introduce her, I'm still going to do that. So, so Kica Matos is the director of immigrants rights and racial justice at the Center for Community Change. And I'll just read a little bit about the Center of Community Change. Founded in 1968, the mission of the Center for Community Change is to build the power and capacity of low-income people, especially low-income people of color, to have a significant impact in improving their communities and the policies and institutions that affect their lives. The center strengthens, connects, and mobilizes grassroots groups to enhance their leadership, voice, and power. We believe that vibrant community-based organizations led by the people most affected by social and economic injustice are key to putting to an end the failed, quote, on your own mentality of the right and building a new politics based on community values. And so I'd also just like to quickly read a little tiny excerpt from an article that Paul Bass wrote in the New Haven Independent following a sort of our recent scare over this proposed DoD center. Matos says, the news of the FBI's planned use of the research deeply troubles her. Quote, I am still deeply troubled that they would decide to experiment in our community, meaning the immigrant community in New Haven, that they would specifically target immigrants in our community to use them as lab rats. That's something this community will not tolerate. Interrogations are coercive. Why are they targeting people of color? It presupposes that the people they need to most worry about, the people they are most concerned with, are people of color. And so I think this gets back to Dr. Siegel's second point about sort of, is this a group of protected subjects? And I think his point is well taken that yes. And also sort of like what are the underlying logics in the study that he asked us to look at, I believe, and maybe you can help me out, I think it was sort of immigrants to the United States from Morocco and Sudan. That were just sort of Muslim men that were targeted as to stand in essentially as the sort of the category of terrorist in this study. So what are the underlying logics there? in that proposed study and the potentially proposed interview training center. And so as we did a little bit of investigation with one of the researchers, it seemed, again, I think, as Roy pointed out, that, you know, how could this be bad? Like, what's the problem? We're paying people. Like, why are you concerned? People are happy to get $100, $50 for our research, as if there was just sort of like nothing at all that anyone should be concerned about, particularly about the underlying logics about who's being chosen and why, but also that there might not be any sort of residual effects for calling out certain groups of people and using them in ways that sort of differentiated and stigmatized and excluded an already differentiated and excluded population of people in New Haven and in the U.S. more broadly. And so, of course, again, I'm really sad because her voice is a voice that needs to be in this room, and mine doesn't stand in for it. But I just wanted to make sure that we had some of her words, at least as I read them, and I know that during our Q&A we'll have more time to discuss. So, that's that.
So I am Chris Hebden. I'm a graduate student in environmental anthropology, and the next two speakers are going to be Steve Horn and Alan Ruff. And actually, does somebody have Alan's?
Jamie's going to introduce Alan afterwards.
Right. Because Alan is, I think Steve is supposed to go next.
No, I was going to leave.
Okay.
Oh, okay. Then maybe Jamie can introduce Alan.
Okay. I'll go next.
That's okay.
Hi everybody, I'm Jamie Myers McPhail. I live in New Haven and I work with organizations organizing for economic and racial justice. And I'm honored to introduce Alan Ruff, who actually grew up here in New Haven. Alan holds a PhD in U.S. history from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And his formal academic work has focused primarily on U.S. social history, but he spent decades as an activist critic of U.S. foreign policy. And today his primary focus is on the Middle East, Central Asia, and U.S. imperial planning. He also hosts a weekly talk show which focuses on domestic and foreign policy issues on WORT-FM in Madison. His writing has appeared in such publications as The Progressive Magazine, Truth Out, Counterpunch, Against the Current, and others. His commentary and analysis on issues foreign and domestic can also be found on his occasional blog, Ruff Talk, spelled like his name. So please welcome Alan Ruff.
Well, thank you very much. It's certainly a pleasure to be back. It's been a long time. I want to talk about the broader context for what Steve and I, beginning some 2.5, almost 3 years ago now, came to call the Long War University. The quest for a new grand strategy, post-Cold War and post-September 11th world, became a paramount issue for strategic planners here in the U.S. The end of containment, first articulated in 1946 or 7, as many of you may know, by George Kennan, became a unifying and mobilizing agent for the post-World War II American imperial mission. But with the end of the Cold War, that came to an end. It led to the demise of this national narrative regarding the U.S. role as a leader in the free world. That's been made more recently made more complex in the post-September 11th world, especially in the recent years, by the loss of the saliency, really, as a mobilizing vehicle of what we came to know as the global war on terror. That has set off in the past 2-3 years, certainly, an attempt to find a new grand strategy, a way to mobilize political support and public opinion at home. Major universities throughout the country have received attention from the national security state and the Pentagon as key institutions of the national fundamental for the preparation at numerous levels of, again, mobilizing domestic support at home for, now of course, the involvement of our major universities and our elite universities, whether it be the Ivies or a place like the University of Wisconsin, is nothing new. And there's a longer historical literature on the involvement of universities as fundamental institutions. What's new are the levels of sophistication and coordination that are now taking place. There's another context going on. What we've witnessed in recent years through the Bush administration and now carrying over into the Obama administration is the ascendancy of the Pentagon as foreign policy, as a fundamental institution, key institution in shaping foreign policy objectives, bypassing in some sense the traditional role of the State Department. We've witnessed the rise of what Steve and I and others are now referred to as warrior intellectuals. That is, people that come directly out of the military who are now in the academy, and they're what we call, others call, the semi-warrior allies, those who have always been academics, basically, who now bypass the Department of State bureaucracy and work hand in glove, really, with the ascendancy of the National Security Council and the Joint Chiefs of Staff in plotting out future direction and really imperial designs. This was personified or exemplified by the Obama's announcement of the Pacific in January of 2012. What was symbolic about it? It was the first time ever that the president made a statement not from the Oval Office of the White House, but from the press room of the Pentagon. Part of an important component of this whole network, really, of this whole nexus, is what Steve and I have come to refer to as the Grand Strategy Network. That is a number of schools with programs and various functions such as not just as you know, is often explained at Yale, teaching and training and the placement of people high up in the national security state apparatus, they also carry out simulations where they bring in, a simulation at Yale that's been copied at Wisconsin has been, you know, the folks running the GSP at Yale, John Gaddis and Charlie Hill and Paul Kennedy and others, give the students projects, national emergency situation that they have to prepare a response to. We can talk about that a little bit later. Yale, some of you may know, has been central, fundamental to this Grand Strategy Network. Again, program founded under the auspices of John Gaddis, the Dean of the Conservative Cold War Historians, Paul Kennedy, globalist historian, and Charlie Hill, the diplomat in residence at Yale, and I must say an unindicted co-conspirator under George Shultz, Secretary of State in the Iran-Contra affair of the Reagan-era 80s. Yale, of course, had already been the home to the International Studies program, a program funded extensively by basically right-wing, ultra-conservative foundations, the John Owen Foundation, Smith Richardson, and others. As I mentioned, the GSP had various various functions: the training of tomorrow's national leadership, placement in the national security state bureaucracies in the corporate world, and importantly, placement in the academy, positions of influence. Yale is also, as the program has gone on and developed at Yale, it's also brought in guest observers and participants, readily publicly spoken about at the time, often under a veil of secrecy or certainly a lack of transparency. Observer participants in grand strategy seminars from the CIA, the Marine Corps, West Point cadets. The program that was developed at Yale was expanded in beginning in September of 2008, when Roger Hertog, a very well-known patron of the right, he calls himself a man of the right, came to Yale, and the folks running the program there, Gaddis and Kennedy and so on, brought together a number of aspiring academics, primarily graduate students in history and political science from around the country. And Hertog told him that he wanted to expand the Yale program and promised a total of more than $10 million over the next several years to expand the program, to bring it, again, make it a nationwide endeavor. Several campuses basically won contracts, or academics at several at several universities won contracts, grants from Roger Hertog. Most notably among them at Duke University, Peter Fieber, and the early Yale Grand Strategy grad, now at Duke, Hal Brands, initiated what is called there the Program in American Grand Strategy. Again, headed by Fieber, who's a significant figure in strategic planning within what, again, Steve and I have referred to now as the Long War University. Fieber is the director of the Triangle Institute of Security Studies, the TISS, a strategic policy consortium with affiliates at Duke, the University of North Carolina, and NC State. The homepage for the Duke Grand Strategy program is very upfront, more upfront than most of these programs, in stating, quote, American Grand Strategy is the collection of plans and policies by which the leadership of the United States mobilizes and deploys the country's resources and capabilities, both military and non-military, to achieve national goals. Of course, we always hear the term national interest, and whenever I hear it, I have to ask, interest for whom? At Temple University, the recipient of Hertog money and a key player in this grand strategy network, there's the Foreign Policy Research Institute, and the center, I love the acronym, it's called CENFAD, but I like the title of the program much more, the Center for Force and Diplomacy, headed by Professor Richard Immerman, and also connected to various former Yale grads. At Columbia University, the program is headed by Matthew Connolly. The program is called the Hertog Global Strategy Initiative, and Matthew Connolly, too, came out of Yale, studying with the previous mentioned faculty. Steve Horn, sitting here with me, will go into a kind of a case study of what went on under Gaddis and Kennedy student Jeremy Surrey at Wisconsin here. A major, this network is the University of Texas at Austin. increasingly significant player with people like William Imboden and Mark Lawrence, again out of Yale, and Suri out of Yale, who are now at the Strauss Center for International Security and Law. Other major players at Texas include Bobby Ray Inman, who was a former major naval officer, at one time up to become deputy director of the CIA, and Philip Bobbitt, also with this Roger Hertog program on law and national security. He's also with the Roger Hertog program on law and national security at Columbia University Law School. He's a senior fellow at the Strauss. One of the people that has come out of this program at Yale is Jeb Nadiner. And for me, he, in a sense, personifies the semi-warrior intellectual who has made his ascent in the post-September 11th environment. He was a Paul Kennedy student, did his grad work in the history of strategy, left in 2002 to become a speechwriter for Secretary of State Colin Powell. He's been a member of the State Department's policy and planning staff. In 2004, he worked on the, quote, war on terrorism strategy as a special assistant to Donald Rumsfeld's Undersecretary of Defense at the time, Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, the neoconservative war hawk, Douglas Feith. He went on to become Assistant Secretary of Defense, and more recently in 2008, he switched over to the private sector. It's between the national security state, the academy, and the corporate world is very well known and well documented. He, in 2008, became Director of Strategy at the nation's top defense contractor, Lockheed Martin, where he now sits as, for Lockheed Martin, Director of National Security Innovation. One important component of this network is the revved up national security imperial state corporate military university complex. There are numerous, again, we're just talking here about a quick sketch, numerous conclaves held at places such as the Navy War College, where there are summer school sessions on the teaching of grand strategy, where all of the academics meet with naval officers to plot out the teaching of how grand strategy works and how to utilize it in the universities. There's the National Defense University Strategic Planning in the Grand Strategy sense. The Imperial War Colleges, in the sense, have become increasingly wedded to the traditional public and private liberal universities. These institutes, and there's a slew of them that I don't have the time to go into now, these institutes and think tanks and the grand strategy as a product work toward forming a new imperial consensus, a new consensus among what is often referred to, commonly referred to as the neocons, people that would normally be considered, say, corporate liberals. There's the Center for a New American Strategy, an imperial liberal hawk counter to the neocon infamous Project for a New American Century. That is headed by the previous speaker mentioned John Nagl. John Nagl is a prominent warrior intellectual. He was one of the key contributors to General David Petraeus' counterinsurgency manual. More recently, and this is something Steve and I have written about, there's been a major proposal for a new grand strategy, called the National Strategic Narrative, done under the auspices, importantly, of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, launched at the Woodrow Wilson Center amidst the great hoopla in 2011, as an example of the ascendancy of the Pentagon imperial policy. Again, this was a quick sketch we can maybe get into some of this in Q&A. Again, I want to thank you folks at Yale for having us participate. Thank you.
Next up we have Steve Horn, who is a Madison, Wisconsin-based research fellow at DSmog blog and a contributing editor at Counterpunch. He has written for The Nation, The Guardian, In These Times, and other publications. So please welcome him.
Well, thanks for having me, and I'm going to kind of do a little bit more specific version at looking at the UW-Madison example of the grant strategy program that actually no longer exists, but was very sort of the agenda of the grant strategy program and the broader long war university agenda. It's formerly run by a guy by the name of Jeremy Surrey, who, as Alan mentioned in his talk, is a Yale PhD. He went to Yale between 1996 and 2001. And actually, before coming to Yale, he got his master's degree at Ohio University. Important to note, because that is at the same time that John Gaddis left Ohio University with Surrey to come to Yale. And sort of in those 5 years, a lot of this group that Alan talked about, a lot of them were students together as PhD students who went on to lead other grant strategy programs, including Surrey. And Surrey is actually a pretty newsworthy figure right now. On Saturday, in the Saturday edition of the New York Times, he wrote an article titled Bomb North Korea Now Before It's Too Late. The article kind of made some waves. People were kind of asked, it kind of, I think, made our article a little bit more relevant and brought it to current day. So I'm going to talk about who Surrey is. I'm going to talk about who another guy is still at UW, and sort of who they are connects to the broader agenda. It tells a much broader story. So, as I mentioned, Surrey was a Gaddis student, and he basically is most famous for a book that he wrote called Henry Kissinger and the New American Century, a book in which he has an entire chapter devoted to Henry Kissinger's time at Harvard, actually running a program kind of like the Grand Strategy program today. It's basically a chapter that essentially stenography where he glorifies what Kissinger was doing at Harvard, and it's very clear, from Alan and I's perspective, that this writing about the program was a preview of what was to come. This book was written in 2000. UW-Madison started in 2009. Basically, it talks about it in a way that you read it and you see how that's actually what ended up happening at UW-Madison. So Surrey went on to write a book right when he left UW-Madison for University of Texas Austin, which is another tentacle of the Grand Strategy Program network. He wrote a book called Liberty, Surest Guardian, Nation Building from the Founders to Obama. And that's important to note also because Surrey himself has written articles openly where he goes toe-to-toe with some pretty legitimate scholars and said there's actually no such thing as an American empire. He says that in one article in Salon that was written recently in the past couple of years, he said that nation building is different than imperialism. I don't really know how that he could go and say that if he actually gave a definition of imperialism, which is direct or indirect rule over another population. I don't know how, quote, nation building wouldn't fit into that paradigm, but that's for another day, a topic for another day. So Surrey left for Austin. His salary doubled. He's now getting paid $220,000 a year to put out scholarship like that appears in Liberty, Surest Guardian. And I think it's important to note that UW-Madison itself is an institution which has a sort of rich history of producing sort of dissenting history, a different view of what American foreign policy history is. The man that sort of exemplifies this is a guy by the name of William Appleman Williams, author of the book Contours of American History, author of the book Empire as a Way of Life. Surrey kind of followed this tradition at UW-Madison. I would say pretty much disgraced it. Unfortunate that he was there as long as he was there for 1 decade, and while he was there, he started the Grand Strategy Program in 2000. The Grand Strategy program was very interesting at UW-Madison. It was basically started with $200,000 of seed money from the aforementioned Roger Hertog. Most of that money went to this summer 8-week course where active duty military officers would basically get courses funded through Hertog's money. The goal being to eventually have 9,000 students enrolled in it. That never actually happened because the UW program does not exist any longer. But there are many articles that talk about who some of these military people were, what they got out of this course, but it was through and through, although the rhetoric was that it was to just basically create a culture of strategic thinking. All in all, it was a military program and the other thing that Hertog's money did was create a lecture series that happened throughout the time that Surrey was there, where lots of people from the broader Grand Strategy Program network were brought into UW for speaking, but also publicized that we learned from open records requests was that they were having meetings with students, undergraduate students basically, who with the hopes that these would become their future mentors. Many people who were former intelligence people or semi-warrior intellectual types that Alan talked about. Basically, a lot of people that were in the Grand Strategy Program nationwide. Peter Fever came in to spoke. A guy by the name of Pete Mansour from OSU, Ohio State University, came in to speak. And it's a very tight-knit circle. These people know each other, they're friends, etc. So I want to point to another key funder of UW Grand Strategy Program above and beyond Hertog, a guy by the name of Sheldon Lubar. Sheldon Lubar connects right back to Yale on the Grand Strategy Program there, is on the board of directors of a firm by the name of Darby Private Equity, which also on the board of directors are guys by the names of Nicholas Brady and Charles Johnson, who a few years ago gave $17 million to the huge funders of the program, huge supporters of it. Lubar is also a former associate of the Bradley Foundation, a very important outfit that lots of people focus in and hone in on the Coke industries, the Coke Foundation, the Cocopus, and miss what I think is rightfully been called the Bradley Empire. They give a lot of money to a lot of right-wing corporate causes, and Lubar is also on the board of directors of the UW Foundation, and he's a major funder of the Grand Strategy Program. And the UW-Milwaukee Business School is named after him. So coming full circle, while Surrey was a professor at UW, he was instrumental in the hiring of a guy by the name of John Hall, a historian, a military historian who comes from the same network. He was a former Army Ranger, which falls under the command of the U.S. Special Operations Command, which is really important for today in terms of, and gained a lot of publicity after the Bin Laden killing, and will be highlighted heavily in Jeremy Surrey's forthcoming book, Dirty Wars. But so he got his PhD from UNC, at University of North Carolina, which is part of the TIS that Alan talked about, Triangle Institute for Strategic Studies, which Duke is also part of, and Duke's part of the Grand Strategy Program. So Hall was hired on basically by Surrey. Surrey led the hiring committee. We've got records that pretty much showed that Surrey was pushing his hiring along. And as soon as Hall came into UW-Madison, he basically was right on board with the Grand Strategy Program. So much so that in the fall of 2009, UW-Madison was contacted by the U.S. Army to help with its capstone concept. At the time, under the auspices, which stands for the, TRODA. Yeah, sorry, kind of forgot TRODA. So the U.S. Army TRODA, Training and Doctrine Command, yes. Under the auspices of TRODA, they wrote something known as the capstone concept. At the time, it was led by Martin Dempsey, who is now head of the United States Joint Chiefs of Staff. So he went from the TRODA to that. And they were consulting directly with UW-Madison on military strategy, which basically flew in the face of a lot of the public reality of what the purpose of the Grand Strategy Program was, what they were up to, etc. This was never actually highlighted in the media. It's something we found out through open records requests. This concept itself basically is the precursor to what we're looking at today for United States military policy in terms of a lighter footprint around the world, technologization of military in terms of drone warfare, sort of a beefed up version of the whole target assassinations, kind of the switch over. Before that was the counterinsurgency doctrine. This is the new doctrine. Basically, UW-Madison through Hall, who is a former colleague of an important figure by the name of H.R. McMaster. I should point out that he was in the inner circle with David Petraeus, who wrote up the Iraq surge plan years before the capstone concept. Hall himself came from Chadha. He was in the future warfare division there. So this coming full circle, there's basically ties straight to the top of U.S. military strategic planning at UW-Madison, which we highlighted in our article. And I guess I just want to quote from our article that was a quote from the actual Grand Strategy Program. Mission statement, and coming from the beginning of my talk where I talked about the history of dissent at UW. UW was a place where there were lots of protests during the Vietnam War. People still somehow see Madison as still kind of a radical place. So Al and I would probably argue against that, but the Grand Strategy Program mission statement, which is no longer up online, says that the purpose of it is a new collaboration between the military and academic worlds and a means of overcoming the divisiveness and political polarization that have characterized the relationship since the Vietnam conflict. So I guess just closing and saying that there will be lots of talk, there is lots of talk that the Grand Strategy Program is just any other type of program, that it is a place for critical thinking, and a place for just talking about current military affairs and open atmosphere, but the record shows that lots of things have not been very transparent about it, and it has a very specific purpose, and that's actually to stymie critical thinking about U.S. military affairs and U.S. foreign policy. We noted that in 2 articles on this program, and I think it's just sort of a case study of the militarization of the Academy and the Long War University at large. And I just want to thank you guys for having me again.
So that concludes the presentations from our speakers. We will now hear from our 2 respondents, and I'd like to thank them again for joining us. First, we'll hear from Birgit Brander Rasmussen, who is here at Yale Assistant Professor of American Studies and Ethnicity, Race, and Migration. She received her PhD from UC Berkeley's Ethnic Studies Department. Her scholarship focuses on race, writing, colonialism, and American literature. And I'll introduce Omar Bajwa right away. He is the coordinator of Muslim life at Yale in the chaplain's office here. He has been engaged in religious service, social activism, and educational outreach for the past about 10 years. His interests include Islam in the United States, interfaith activities, Islam and the global media, and transnational religious and intellectual networks. Please join me in welcoming them.
Start us off, I guess. First of all, thank you very much to the organizers for doing the work at this very busy time of the semester, putting on such a crucial symposium, and of course I'm grateful and honored to be invited. And thank you to the speakers who brought such a range of expertise. It was really informative, actually. So I've been asked to just serve as a respondent, and so I'll just give some brief sort of impressionistic responses, starting with Dr. Siegel's very interesting presentation, which really reminded me of why it is so important to pay careful attention to words and, you know, good close reading skills and so forth. I mean, your presentation was really model in that sense, and, you know, reminding us, you know, I was looking at what you put up there and thinking about words like real-world professionals, non-native samples, right? What does this mean, and how does this make us think about things? And then, of course, in particular, the Islamic terrorist and the notion of an Islamic terrorist, which these, it seems to me that these immigrants, in some sense, are asked to embody, because no one really, what is that anyway, right? Who even knows how an Islamic terrorist looks like? And so it seems to me that part of the, and I have to say to some extent, I'm sort of stunned that that was approved and that went on. And, you know, thinking about the implications of it, you know, part of what really struck me there is the way in which Muslim immigrants, Moroccans and Sudanese immigrants in this particular case, are asked to sort of stand in for and represent that absent, and in a sense embody that absent sort of enemy, right? And then the pedagogy that is performed during this this research, right? Both in terms of the effect on the researchers, who then internalize, in a sense, that those research subjects as sort of representing that enemy, and of course the subjects themselves. So both, you know, for the military, how are they imagining their enemies, and how are they asking people to almost sort of play act those enemies, people of particular phenotypes, right? Again, the Sudanese, although there were not that many there, I think we should also think very carefully about the sort of long history of state antagonism to black Muslims in the United States, and so the ways that a Sudanese immigrant can sort of collapse all these categories in very dangerous ways. Terms like minimal risk. What does minimal risk mean? Particularly, again, then the issue of this sort of larger collateral damage, right, and the dangers there. How do we measure risk or harm in cases like this? The other thing, I suppose, that really came to my mind as I heard the subsequent presentations, both in terms of the ways in which the military funds what seemed like very useful research on, say, autism and so forth, right? I'm nonetheless sort of arrested by this question of what happens, or what are the consequences, or are there consequences when such funding detours via the military, right? Versus, so even though that seems quite innocuous, in some sense, I don't understand why the detour through the military. Why are we not simply taking those taxpayer dollars and moving them directly into research in a sense, right? And so there's all kinds of really important questions that are being raised. 10 million people, in addition to the VA, are affected by the military health care. That's an enormous number, and it suggests something to us of what the investment is and the connection, so that the tentacles and filaments, not only in terms of, say, the way the grand strategy ideology and network is being elaborated, but also then the many different ways in which the military becomes the viable option for research funding, for careers, for all kinds of, that generate a sort of broader investment in a sense. The other issue that then came up to me, that on the one hand, we are trying, and I think very importantly, trying to pay some attention to the presence of the military on campus. The harder thing to see, but for me, there's a sort of a specter behind that, or sort of haunting of what is the presence of, in a sense, the campus in the military. What kind of campus, for example, is Guantanamo, right? So part of our concern here is that this research is being done in our name, so to speak, because it has Yale's name attached to it, or because it's situated in New Haven. Where does that in our name thing end? right? And how do we delineate that? And what are the purposes? So again, the level of deception that was in the proposal and so forth, right? So Anne McClintock has famously raised the question, what is the purpose of a Guantanamo? And in particular, what is the purpose of torturing people that are known to be innocent and not have information, right? And these sort of laboratory research purposes that are ultimately potentially about figuring out how to most effectively break people and so forth. The final thing that I was left with after hearing from Madison, where I was employed before I came here as an assistant professor, I had the, I will admit, dubious pleasure of knowing Jeremy Surrey. I remember well the very controversial hiring of Professor Hall, because my partner was in the history department. It caused a lot of division. So one thing I will say, though, is that in some way I'm struck, as I always am, when I hear about the sort of organization, so to speak, on the right, by its effectiveness, right? And so to some extent, I wonder what would it mean for us to begin to think of ourselves as also capable of having a network of tentacles and filaments dedicated to something very different, right? How to create and foster networks that can articulate a very different vision and ideology that promotes, you know, sort of life and justice and dignity and so forth. And yes, perhaps also foreign policy. So in some ways, a grand strategy seems to be almost the opposite of what I've been trained to do, right? But to some extent, can we also think of ourselves as capable of articulating not just resistance or interrogation, but a real sort of coherent set of values or an ideology organized around, as one speaker said, community and so forth, right? So those were some of my thoughts, and I look forward to hearing from Omar.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much to the organizers. I really appreciate being here. I've enjoyed hearing all of the presentations. In fact, I wanted to sit in the audience and just learn. Like, I'm being honest. I talked to the organizers about this. It was enough to just be invited to sit in the audience. When I'm hearing this, I'm going to keep it very brief because I really want to get into the conversation. I am hearing it with two hats. So I was doing in a doctoral program in Middle Eastern Studies at Cornell. And I studied, this is all very fascinating. I was looking at a lot of this kind of stuff with the interest of the people in IR and poli-sci and how they wanted to work with area studies, and I did contemporary Middle Eastern studies, and I was looking at pedagogical systems, and they really wanted to have conversations, but I was always very curious about the agenda of those conversations on, you know, what are jihad universities, what are they pumping out? I looked at the madrasa system internationally as well as domestically. So I mean, I very early on as a graduate student was exposed to why people want to have this conversation, so I really appreciated the later half of the presentation about the long war university, on sort of the history of this, getting post-Cold War to where we are now. I mean, it's very sickening. I was like getting nauseated as I was hearing this. So that's one hat, and I wish I could respond to that hat. But to keep it very brief, I'm going to respond with a different hat. I'm a Muslim chaplain here. I've been here for 5 years at Yale. It's an honor and a privilege and a blessing, I have to say, to be a part of the Yale University, despite all of these blemishes and cancer sores that we have. That is a part of the university. But the last thing that I'm going to focus on here is this. So February 18th, 2012, last year, it was a Saturday, and I'm just going to walk you through something. We do an annual conference called the Ivy Muslim Conference, and it was a project I started 4 years ago. I take a lot of pride in it, in that we invite 150 Muslim students from across the Ivy League. And these are very bright, very talented, very ambitious, and in some ways very these are people who take their Muslim identity very seriously, across all of our 7 sister institutions. And we had a conference, and we bring them together for networking and fellowship, and sort of we debate and discuss a lot of the issues in our community. We had, and this is what I'm getting at, we had a farewell dinner. It was a Saturday evening, if anyone remembers. February 18th, we had a farewell dinner, and my phone just kept getting all these text messages from one of my students who wasn't at the dinner. And he says, I need to talk to you right now. Please. And I said, well, I'm serving dinner right now. Can we talk later? He says, okay, call me as soon as you're done. So as soon as I had a chance, I called him. And he said, have you read the news? And what I'm trying to get at right now is that was the day that the AP broke the story of the NYPD spying scandal. That named 16 universities. Yale was at the top of that list. It included Penn, it included Columbia, it included Syracuse, it included the CUNY schools. Now, all things considered, Now, I don't want to over-dramatize this. All things considered, the amount of surveillance that the NYPD was doing as part of this, I think it's called the Human Demographics Unit mapping system that they had CIA, cooperation with. Yale was actually like not one of their major concerns. But the fact that it happened at Yale, and the fact that, for me, it was a tragic irony that I had peers from across our sister universities here, and people were just freaked out. I mean, there's no other way to say it. Is the fact that we thought by working hard, by getting to these places, as being part of the model minority of wanting to engage in community life and all of that blah 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 blah, is that we would somehow be immune from this. But what it tells you is, at the end of the day, there's a neo-imperial project. The university's been co-opted. The university as a whole, as we've already heard. I think Yale in particular. And I mean, where does this leave us now? So when I heard about the DoD project with Yale Med, it was frightening, but it was also just kind of like, well, here we go again. So the last thing, and I already spoke longer than I intended to, the last thing that I want to leave you with is, right now in this conversation across the country about national security, where I stand as a Muslim community leader on and off campus, I have to say that the intelligence agencies, whether it's the NSA, whether it's the NCTC, whether it's the FBI or the CIA, they have done a pathetic and incompetent job of, in any responsible way, like liaising with the Muslim community. And I mean, this is on the record. Their track record shows it. And I guess, when I talk to my community, when I minister to them, we thought we were kind of insulated here, and that these are the kids. I know Muslims that get tapped by skulls. I know Muslims that are getting recruited by the CIA that want to be FBI interpreters and stuff like that. And at the end, what is the ethics behind all of this? Like, if you're taking a national security angle, the people that you would want to have some responsible, respectful relationship with, this is what you do to them on and off campus. I mean, you just have really bad leadership, is what I have to say. And I went on longer than I intended to, and I hate to end on a depressing note. I'm sorry about that. I'm supposed to bring joy and hope to people in my ministry and stuff like that. But I mean, this cuts close to home, is what I'm trying to say. So I look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
I think it might be better if you're facing everyone. We would love to take questions, comments, thoughts, reactions from people here. Yes, please.
This is specifically to Professor Siegel. Professor, thank you for your talk. It was very interesting. But I wanted, so basically, I think, specifically your claims pertain to 2 points. One is like the grand claim, which is to separate university from military and military research, and the one pertaining to the research itself. I want to touch upon both these points shortly. First of all, regarding your grand claim, which is to separate military from university, I have to say that I tend to agree with Professor Latham in saying that it's not necessarily a bad thing to divide the two, as long as you pay attention to the specific individual study. As long as you ensure that it's ethical. And I say this because, first of all, from my own personal experience as a soldier in the Israeli military, so they conducted research on me and on my friends, and no one asked for my informed consent, and there was no IRB to protect me. So I guess my point is that research is going to be performed no matter what. And why not do it through a university or through an IRB that potentially, it's not perfect, obviously, but potentially can actually defend those people. And then you will get some scrutiny, again, not perfect. And of course, we all here know that medical research in general doesn't have to be connected to military in order to be unethical. I think we all know that. So again, I'm not the last one to protect, medical research or military stuff in general. So that goes to the grand claim. regarding your specific study, I have basically 5 points I didn't quite understand, but let me just say one, which I think is the most important. You said that the subjects were you assumed that there were disadvantages, and basically I don't understand why you claim that. Because, first of all, I think you assume, I think that just assuming it without justification is wrong because, first of all, as you're well aware, in medical research, we use, in order to get to a conclusion, we use a specific population. So we stratify. So even in medical literature, even 10 years is a factor in stratification. So I'm not justifying it. As a student of Edward Said, I'm not saying they're right. But I can see why a reviewer, for example, of this study would say, oh no, this cannot be published because you didn't research on the same subjects you are doing your conclusion on. And the second point is that these subjects, again, I'm not saying it's the case, but it could be argued that these subjects are going to benefit from this study if you assume that this study is meant to protect the security of the American people. If some terrorist comes and with a bomb and then and yeah, that's basically. I have more points, but maybe if we have time.
Well, okay, let me respond to both of them. Really excellent questions and points. So first, in terms of the overall picture of university and military research, let me make it very clear that I wasn't arguing that there should be a complete separation of research, that the university should not take Department of Defense dollars. I'm very much in agreement with what Steve said, which is that a lot of what the Department of Defense funds is legitimate research that has very good aims. In fact, I would go so far as to say, and I want to make this point specifically, that the very professor whose work I'm criticizing at the School of Medicine is doing what I would call brilliant work, a critical work that is funded by the same Department of Defense. He's doing, for example, work on post-traumatic stress disorder in veterans. And this is critical work. I mean, we veterans have done a service to the country. We owe it to them to treat them for diseases that they've incurred, especially if they've done it in service of the country. And so that work is I think, is vital and critical. And so the point I was making is not that the university should not take any Department of Defense funding, but that you need to look at the mission of the specific department in the school, or the department school that's doing the work. So for example, it may be the case that a particular study is appropriate for, say, the School of Engineering, but may not be appropriate for the School of Medicine. And so if the Department of Defense were to come and say, we need some better airplanes, so we're going to go to the School of Engineering, can you help us build planes that fly better? That may be within the mission of the School of Engineering, because better airplanes can help not just the military, but everyone. So it may be the case that research like that may be appropriate for a particular school within the university. But for the School of Medicine to fund research to improve the capacity of military airplanes makes no sense, because it doesn't fit into the mission. So I guess what I'm arguing is you have to look, just as Steve said, you have to look at any particular proposal, take it on a case-by-case basis. I'm not trying to make any generalization that there should be no military research at universities, that there should be even no military research at medical schools. I'm looking at this on a case-by-case basis, saying that in this particular case, the objectives of the research were strictly to fulfill military objectives. There was no human health or disease or medical objective, and therefore, I think it's not within the purview of the medical school. Second, as far as the second question was, why are these immigrants considered a disadvantaged population? And I would argue that there are several reasons, but the first is that by very nature of being immigrants, many of these subjects are subject to potentially being deported. Not all of them are necessarily documented immigrants. And that presents a very strong coercive element, because if a person knows that they may be deported, subject to deportation, and a official is having any kind of dialogue with that person, there is a potential threat, if not of, whether it's not, I'm not saying it's stated, obviously, but there's a threat in the back of their mind. If I don't cooperate, maybe I'm not going to be, be able to stay here. Immigrant populations, by their very nature, are disadvantaged also because of their status in the country. Their status in the country is not, they don't have the same opportunities that other populations do. And in particular, I would argue that Muslim immigrants, which these particular groups represented, are disadvantaged simply because of the way they're treated. I mean, we just heard about, we just heard from Omar about the security, the wiretapping, the security surveillance that was done to people simply because they're Muslim. And so I would argue that automatically puts them in a disadvantaged group.
Sure, Alex, please.
So, Professor Latham, I wanted to ask about sort of how we, if we do accept that sort of military funding in general is no more problematic than funding from any source, because any source is going to have some sort of motivation, which I think is an important point to make. How can we, and are we equipped to, right now, look at the individual studies and figure out which ones are ethical and which ones aren't? Because it seems like, for example, this study that Professor Siegel talked about is, if the researchers had been more careful, they could have disguised it as basic research into whether or not the heart, does certain things when, your brain is involved in lying or telling the truth, which is interesting just for the advancement of human knowledge. And that's worrisome because it's still, like, even if they had written the study that way, what would be happening is still that university researchers, because of what money is available, would be doing research that resulted in sort of increased militarization and increased effectiveness of the US military achieving its goals. And so, given that, and given that sort of like risk in that study is only looked at very narrowly in terms of like whether the electrodes are actually going to hurt the person rather than the sort of pedagogical things that are going on. What could be done to distinguish between research that should be happening and research that shouldn't?
A couple of possible answers. First, I think in the Republic, Plato says that the physician who has the greatest skill is also the best poisoner. And I think there is no way, no matter who sponsors research, as Art Golston found out, there's no way that you can do research that won't one day be used for some end that you don't approve of, whether it's social science research or medical research or anything. It's very hard to control what people do with knowledge. But to really answer the question you're posing, two possible things to rely on. One, I take that Michael's relying on an ideal of professional ethics, fundamentally. This is not the business that doctors should be in, and this is not the business that a doctor's school should be in. And there are professional ethics established for a lot of different fields of research, and you can lean on some of those standards in judging projects. And the other thing is the system that we have in place, which is not great, which is the IRB, where a group of basically people of goodwill who are really who are volunteers, who are trying to protect human subjects, get together in a room and look at the proposal, and they say, who's going to get harmed by this? How does that compare? But it's not good for several reasons. One is it's massively decentralized. So different universities can have different judgments, and if you can't do a research project here, maybe you can do it there. Two is you can't possibly have people in the IRB who are experts in everything, so things can slip by, as we saw last week, the study about the little kids who are getting the oxygen in the neonatal intensive care unit, where Yale was one part of a big multi-center trial that now the Office of Human Research Protection says the parents of these premature kids weren't warned about risks to their vision and risks about brain damage and so on. The IRB let that one go through, I'm guessing, but likely because there was no one around that table who had enough familiarity with things like oxygenation of neonates to know more than the researcher had disclosed. The researcher was from a different university. More than that person disclosed about what the risks might be. Right? It's really hard to do this very thoroughly. So one kind of proposal that I think was put forward by Zeke Emanuel years ago was to do regional professional IRBs. Instead of having decentralized university volunteers who are overworked, not only overworked and underpaid, but overworked and not paid at all, and doing their best, but against a pile of protocols that it's hard to judge. Have regional professional IRBs whose full-time job is to do the research to make sure the science is right, all this kind of thing. So we could be maybe doing it better than we're doing it now, but I agree with Zohar's point, which is that, or one of his points, which is that a lot of this research will be done anyway. We've seen in the pharmaceutical industry a lot of research being pulled out of universities and put into private research organizations. It results in a lot less oversight. So the safest place to be a research subject, unfortunately, is in the very imperfect university system in the United States.
We had another question here.
Yeah, thank you to all the panelists. I had the question, which I guess brings, is spurred by the panelists from Madison, is something quite, what I'm most struck by in this conversation is the discussion of the Grand Strategy program here. And I just invite the panelists to talk a little bit about the issues brought up by the panelists in Madison about Grand Strategy and its relation to the rest of the university. It's where funding comes from. It's just a little bit more from here about this program.
I've got something to say. I'm not sure it's what you want, but here it goes. It doesn't surprise me at all that a lot of wealthy people are conservative. It doesn't surprise me that conservative wealthy people donate money to conservative university programs. It doesn't surprise me that it's mostly conservative people in the upper echelons of the military, and that they hire people they met at university programs that attract conservatives and are funded by conservative money. It doesn't surprise me at all. To move from that to say that the university has been co-opted by this national movement is, I think, to do a disservice to Harold Koh, who before he was Hillary Clinton's attorney for the Department of State was trying to do litigation on behalf of Gitmo prisoners. It does a disservice to Jacob Hacker, my nominal boss at the ISPS, who was the inventor of the public option in the big, the big Obama health reform debate. You could think about Betsy Bradley, who's working to try to reframe the way we think about resources in public health and benefits. You could think about Gus Speth at the Forestry School, who's an environmental and global warming activist. I don't think this university is co-opted in by this. There are some prominent people who do this stuff here and other places. There are other prominent people who do completely different stuff.
Another question, yes?
May we respond to that?
Sure.
Please.
For us, it's not a question of the university being co-opted. Because the university, the major universities, and especially the elite universities across the country, are part and parcel, very much integral to foreign policy. Yale has long been, a conduit for decades and decades for elite positions in the national security state, and so on. Yale's not being co-opted. University of Wisconsin is not being co-opted. That is, they're fulfilling a function, a role in that broader system, if you will. So it's not, it's a matter of people at all these institutions having, demanding the transparency and developing a critical perspective on the role of their institutions' involvement in what is oftentimes, an interventionist and on occasion quite nefarious and lethal foreign policy. So again, it's a matter of people at Yale or Wisconsin or Duke or North Carolina or the dozens upon dozens of major universities which have this, similar programs going on to demand, to take up an oppositional position, an oppositional role, and yes, raise the question about what are we here for and what is our role in the society.
I'll just add one more thing. Harold Coe came up just now in the response. Harold Coe is actually part of the Grand Strategy Program summer seminar at Yale this year. And although a more sort of positive picture was just painted of Coe, Coe was also the man who waved the legal wand and made drone strikes legal under Obama. Now he's back at Yale Law School. So although we're talking about that Coe before he became part of the Obama administration, Coe himself is now firmly part of this same group of people. He's welcomed with open arms to the Grand Strategy Program now. So I just think that should be pointed out. Coe has become much more of a controversial figure.
Are you positing an equivalency between Harold Coe and Peter Fever?
I'm not positing any equivalency. I am saying that if you type in Harold Coe and drones on Google, you'll see a different picture of Harold Coe than was just painted of him, and that's kind of how I'll close it. I'm not saying they're equivalent figures, but I don't think that it's, there are some moral questions to be raised about legalizing drone strikes that have killed hundreds of people, innocent people in Pakistan and Afghanistan. So I just want to put that on the table.
Yeah, a question back there. Might be the last one.
Oh, great. Okay, so I've been working on a dissertation on the history of international education, which I've sort of broadly limited, right, and not limiting myself at all, but to say history of how American students have been trained to think and feel about the world over the long 20th century, from kindergarten to university education. And so I have a few questions, because one is that I see in my research that sort of the relationship between U.S. foreign policy aims or U.S. global power and science and medicine and engineering and all of this, but what about the humanities? And also, what about more sort of sentimental or affective modes of education that produce the kinds of citizen subjects that empire requires? Which is also a really blurred line between a military-industrial complex and the university, from kindergarten to university, is sort of what my argument sort of is. And then also, that I'm interested in, so I would like to know what you think about, should I be understanding humanities differently? Should I be understanding sort of affective or sentimental pedagogies that produce certain kinds of American citizens that are prepared and really sort of emotionally to support the spread of U.S. global power? Is that a different project than this blurred line between the military and the sciences and the medicines, right? Medical studies. And then my second question, which is I think related, is that I keep finding the conversations about newness and this idea of the now we have a corporate military university complex. I've been finding that in 1905. In just the same way with Carnegie Endowment for International, whatever it is. So I'm interested in how do we understand this as a new thing? What is new? Is anything new? Is it worse than it was ever before? I'm sorry. Those are the two things I'm thinking about.
Would you like to respond maybe about the humanities? Birgit?
Sure, and I think actually you raise a number of really great questions, including the newness, and it might be more appropriate to just sort of think about sort of different contexts for understanding particular moments. So say there's no such thing as the CIA in, say, 1875, right? But so part of my research is looking at the ways in which sort of the knowledge production that is partly also tied to universities and so forth, but what we might call research or scholarship is also the link between research, Native American communities, and the military. And so in that sense, nothing new, right? So one of the people that gathered the vast majority of information that I've used for some of my work on indigenous literacies was a military person, right? Many military people played crucial roles in the early stages of what we might now think of as sort of anthropology, and it was for the purpose of sort of understanding populations in order to penetrate and colonize and so forth. The issue of the humanities and that kind of education of, because again, it's not just a question of educating subjects who will be subjected to imperialism, but also all of us who will be complicit, right? And so part of what I look at, for example, is Longfellow's Hiawatha. And this poem was incredibly popular and sort of really spread a particular way of understanding the United States, I would say. And it was one in which students, as well as anybody else who consumed or celebrated this poem or saw the performances and so forth, were asked to understand themselves as legitimate heirs of displaced people, even as those people were still in the process of being militarily subjugated. So, you know, I was actually, one of the notes I made to myself was the long war university, I think, can be thought of in a very big stretch, right? And it is not, the new thing may perhaps more be which populations are being specifically targeted, right? And so I'm sort of thinking partly about the relationship between some of these military forts and military bases today, between Fort Marion, as you know, Tyler knows that I've been looking at Fort Marion in Florida, where there's some Kiowa and Cheyenne warriors incarcerated, essentially, indefinite detention in 1875, right? The relationship between that and Guantanamo. And so I think that humanities can ask really crucial questions that, and at the same time, I think I was really sitting here thinking, wow, I as a, you know, I would like a better dialogue with the biological sciences and so forth, because I realize how little I know and understand.
I think, I'll take the side, I guess, that there are some new things, or they're certainly different, and for one thing, science seems to consistently leap ahead of the ethics that might be needed to evaluate it, and so I'll say that seems to have happened again, and the power of scientific advances to be used for good or bad has never been greater, I would imagine. So, you know, 100 years ago, that process was still in play, but I would think the risks were not, in a sense, were not as great, or the benefits. I think there's something different after September 11th here in terms of the comfort with which it's assumed, or more people assume, that the university and the military should have a lot to offer each other, and that there aren't reasons for concern. I think that shifted in some way. And third, although these things may have happened in the past in other forms, I don't think we had situations where, for example, PhD anthropologists were paid, I think, roughly $300,000 a year, which is a better salary than they can probably get teaching, to be embedded with the military in Afghanistan because they have better skills at understanding the community and identifying potential leaders who may be opposed to what the United States is trying to do, so that they are kind of serving the military goals using clearly their professional expertise. So there's something newish. Maybe we could agree on newish.
I want to agree and disagree. I want to agree about something that Joanna Radin, who's in the history of science and medicine, has been doing work on early tissue and blood collection from Native American tribes. As soon as we had good refrigeration, they went out and started collecting blood from different groups, and there's a kind of eugenic background to their desire to do that and all. So there is a lot of commonality, a lot of stuff that can be learned between the dialogue between the sciences and humanities. But I want to object to one thing that you said, which is the idea, which I hear in bioethics a lot, that the science is moving faster than our ethics, or that our ethics needs to catch up. Here's the problem I have with it, and it's strictly a philosophical problem. If ethics is the kind of thing that needs to be constructed by us to catch up with the world, then there's a real problem about what its authority is, because it's something that we just built yesterday to catch up with the world. And by what standard did we do that? I actually think that an idea that it's kind of like saying there are new things in the world that our language can't catch up. But I think we never have any problem talking about the new things in the world. And I think ethics is a lot like language.
Okay, I see what you mean.
Right, it's just a philosophy.
No, right, I understand, but
it's not a university, whatever.
Right, but and I can speak in terms of the psychology profession, that what does happen, what is happening, is psychologists are being pressured to assume, and were pressured to assume new roles, such as, we know psychologists were the ones who reverse engineered the SEER training in order to use that for torture. And it creates challenges for ethics or interpreting the profession's ethics because, for example, one argument that has been used to defend that is, well, who is the client in that situation? And the detainee who's being waterboarded is not the client. The client is the U.S. government. And therefore, as a psychologist, if you are working effectively you are not harming the U.S. government, then it's ethically legitimate. That happened before there was an opportunity for psychologists and ethicists, including in the military, to address it, to kind of consider, well, is that argument persuasive? Does that make sense? Had that conversation and discussion, and which would be a debate. I respected that people would be on different sides. Had that happened first, I think whatever the outcome, we'd be in a better position than the fact that these, quote, opportunities, unquote, for psychologists emerged, people either out of patriotism or financial benefit or whatever, professional advancement, embraced them. And now in psychology, more than a decade after 2001, we are trying to deal with, well, what should our profession's ethics be in terms of psychologists involved in national security operations? That's kind of...
I certainly agree that professional organizations have to construct professional standards, and that takes time, and technology might outpace that for sure. But the way they construct it is that people like you and me already know, without having to construct any new ethics, what's wrong with the argument you just gave. But again, it's a philosophical.
Okay.
Yeah.
Maybe one last question. We're a little bit out of time.
Yeah, I want to address this to Alan and Steve. Is there an equivalency
in the universities, in your view, across the country, is there an equivalency in those who support imperialism and the military nature and the takeover of the country, the military, and takeover of other countries in the military? Is there an equivalency of those who support that and those who oppose it and are able to raise objections to it on all levels? Do you see this kind of equivalency in universities, in Yale, at University of Wisconsin, or as you add up all the universities?
I'm not quite sure what you're asking in regard to equivalency. The universities, I can draw from the history here, and as a matter of fact, I can draw from the history of what I know of Yale. That is, they're contested terrains, right? There are different value systems around the question of war and intervention and empire that do come into conflict. Again, it's an area of contestation. An equivalency, again, maybe you can clarify that a little bit, what you're asking.
Well, we had the example that you gave of a group of Yale professors, John Gaddis and Paul Kennedy and some others. And then you both went through a list of names of people who are developing this grand strategy. So are there people who are developing a grand strategy to prevent that from happening and educating their students to recognize that that is happening and to see beyond it? Because the university creates a universe for its students which may be not the real universe, but some kind of constrained or reduced universe, so that they don't see beyond. They think this is the universe. The students learn this is the universe, but in fact, it's what the university allows them.
Let me respond very quickly by saying that it's now, the website's been taken down because when Jeremy Surrey left, so went the Grand Strategy program at Wisconsin. But in its statement of purpose, Jeremy Surrey wrote, it was like the second paragraph in their mission statement that was on the website, that part of the goal of the Grand Strategy program at the University of Wisconsin was to do away with the divisiveness that had existed on the UW campus since the Vietnam era. Right? So part of the agenda is clearly a revision of the history, a rewriting of the history, a denial of the history in order to neutralize opposition on the campuses across the country to prepare, again, in line with this long war that they're saying, the American public domestically has to be prepared to, support and endure. So that, again, that's the example. I don't know if I got to your question, but yes, there are obviously the numbers of we wouldn't be having this forum right now if there weren't people at Yale who said, hey, something stinks here. One final comment. When I heard about the project at Yale, and I heard that the supporters were saying, well, it wasn't torture, it wasn't interrogation, it was a look at lie detection. The immediate question that came to my mind was, okay, once they determine if somebody is lying, then what? Then what? And an open-ended question, because it clearly goes back to, okay, we're going to make you talk. Maybe they could send in John Negroponte.
Thank you. All right, we are unfortunately going to wrap this up. I would like to thank our panelists, our respondents. We also have a sign-up sheet. We would love for this conversation to continue, namely with some people at the Jackson Institute. That would be really great to hear their point of view on these matters. And there's still so much to discuss, still so many questions. And also, I think, trying to articulate how to move forward. What are specific interventions that we can make in academia, in the IRB, et cetera, to try to hold researchers and the management of universities more accountable. So please sign up, write your info, and we'll try to stay in touch for future projects. Thank you. I never have a pen. You have a pen? I don't have a pen. I have like a marker. You have a pen. Lovely. Thank you.
It was a try. Well, I think that he was being generous. I think someone else look at it the way I look at it. When you have a standing fiscal speed, and hey, it's Sherman.
But they were in the same room.
Oh, I'll say hello to Sherman. I think we should go.
That's crazy because I know that chemistry very well. I know the leadership there. I mean, I was shocked to see it because I was thinking, I tried to train it. I got it 5 years ago. I'm wondering if I know, like they said that they some of the community meetings on the street have done on the population. That was their trouble. And who were they talking to?
I know.
Yeah, I appreciate the take care.
Yeah, you know what?
Yeah. As is their other articles, publications that
Just before I came to Yale full-time, I was adjunct
So you're coming on Friday, you're coming Friday. I think it's left for you to take part in the
I think that's the way it works. There is a renewal process, but
That changes.
One of the things is that
I thought you were saying you can't do the unethical research.
I'm not sure. I don't think the Yale
As am I. I will see you Friday. I just wanted to thank you Thank you so much.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Roy. I really appreciate it. It was absolutely a pleasure meeting you. Thank you also for writing that piece that you.
No, I didn't.
Yeah,
I didn't say that they were
and I thank you for sharing. You know, what was particularly interesting was that the 69 number, the fact that you were able to concretely tell us how many projects at Yale received funding, and then also the percentage.
I think that you make a good point in that if the purpose of the research was to study Islamic Arabic
policies,
graduate
students and postdocs and faculty.
Yeah.
I don't think the Arabic is necessarily set. But they might have been more stringent.
Very, very good.
No, you don't. But part of the problem is that it's not transparent. So in my field of research, we have to get if somebody asks me where so I asked them, so because like you, I want to get specific on the general. So I asked them, can you send it to me? I said the reason is I want to know what they did. And they refused to want to information. That's one of the problems. So it's very interesting.
I was thinking about maybe once there was a debate. Right now, it turns out that when you ask them, so when you said, oh,
it doesn't, I mean, disadvantage by no means that means that you can't study those or that they don't want to participate.
There's a graduate student at
making sure that there's not
University of California State,
I don't know.
Right. School is voted the most military friendly.
Exactly.
And they have,
to me, the biggest thing
they have a program actually called
Military Transparency.
And they have very, very strong ties also to veterans. Part of the program also that they try to have a lot of veterans.
They don't say where the research is done. They don't say,
but also applied research in for the new team. So definitely Yale is kind of a straight. Although
the only way I found that out is so it's very, very mysterious. That's what scares me. When it's transparent, even if you disagree with it, you have the opportunity to discuss. Yes, that's my pleasure.
Fail.
Not all of us are that big.
I'm going to say hi to a few more people. Thank you again.
Very nice to meet you.
Hey, friends. Great to meet you.
Thank you. Very kind and generous. Your name on this thing? Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. How have you been? Is all right? I'm a little sick, actually. I hope I haven't given it to anyone.
I'll stand over
Thank you
here.
so much, Siegel. Your little bit about Kica was really good. Bringing in her quote. Anyway, thank you for that. And for all the show stuff.
It was pleasure. Appreciate it. And of course, for the article.
And all the work you put in. No, really, I could not have done it without you. Thank you.
Are you still
Hey,
here?
thank you for coming. Nice to meet you. I'm Natalie. Are you a student here?
Yeah.
You're not? Right here. Good to have you. You enjoy the discussion? Yeah, thank you for coming. Please. Please. There's still a lot that we didn't get to cover. We really said that Kica.
Yeah, I was just saying that because I've heard a lot about it, but I've never met her.
Well, that's, we're just talking about
Really
I wish that had come out in the discussion.
Yeah.
It wasn't.
Hoping for
No, I also
Do you live in New Haven? Nice. What was the FM event that you were at? With
Well, I work for the CCO meeting in New Haven. And the Yale chapter. I did law enforcement.
No, he opened it up and he said, look, you know,
So like,
Yeah.
be able to ask whatever questions you want.
Absolutely.
And he gave an hour and a half talk.
You're doing definitely connected to these questions.
So,
We really hope to do more stuff and to maybe think about concrete actions that we can take and requests that we can make to the university and things like that. So
cool. Keep me posted.
excellent. Thank you.
that was the one question.
Yeah, that's not good. Who is fancy apple.